I'm going to
Sure.
go. All right, then. We'll let you two introduce yourselves to the rest of us.
Sure, great. Well, thanks so much for having us. My name is Keith Knudsen. I've been with Brightspot since March. My background is mechanical engineering. I've actually spent most of my career in the renewable electricity sector. So primarily in Canada. I'm based out of Calgary, Alberta, and I've been developing wind and solar projects for the better part of my career within different provinces in Canada. And I joined Brightspot back in March to sort of help them develop their renewable energy service offerings, and also just really excited about carbon. I think carbon is such a fascinating tool to help us combat climate change, and looking forward to talking with you about that. So I'll pass over to Sheldon.
Thanks, Keith. So yeah, my name is Sheldon. I've been with Brightspot for 2.5 years now. And my background, I've been working on climate related and climate mitigation specifically initiatives across Canada since 2012. So almost 10 years, and across government and industry and nonprofits. And I don't have a particular focus that I've been working on aside from like specifically climate mitigation, which when I think about it, I mean, when I tell other people, that seems very, very specific, but within the context of climate mitigation, there is so much out there. And I run kind of our operations out of Vancouver. There are 8 of our 17 person team are in Vancouver. And just contextually, Brightspot Climate, we are a climate and energy consultancy with all of our kind of employees and most of our work in Canada. And yeah, largely our focus is climate mitigation. And so we work with industrial emitters, we work with prospective project developers, essentially to figure out what are the best, most efficient ways to reduce emissions across, largely across Canada. And a big part of our business is greenhouse gas verification, which takes place in regulated systems for industrial emitters. But having the context of verification means that we approach kind of everything, including any kind of consulting engagements with a little bit of professional skepticism, which is we find very valuable because we kind of come prepared to the table with the questions kind of an auditor or a verifier would ask. So we find that we provide a lot of value in that sense. And yeah, so I will pass it back to Keith.
Great, thank you. All right, well, let's get things kicked off with a bit of an intro to carbon offsets and markets. And I think, there's probably varying levels of exposure on your team there to this. So I'll just start off with talking a bit about offsets. And, essentially offsets it's an instrument to measure some sort of reduction, removal, or sequestration of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent. And just for a bit of terminology, we talk a lot about CO2e, which is carbon dioxide equivalent. And you may have come across this term in the past, but really there's different molecules, different compounds that get released into the atmosphere. And these molecules have different impacts on global warming. And so, for example, methane here, CH4, it's much more potent in terms of how it impacts global warming. And so it's actually 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So when we talk about carbon dioxide equivalent, what we're trying to do is just bring back these compounds into sort of one normalized, standardized term. And so if you're an emission offset project and you're removing, say, methane from the atmosphere, you're actually removing 25 times the equivalent of carbon dioxide. So it's actually a lot more beneficial for your project to be removing methane than, say, carbon dioxide. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is different types of emission offset projects are going to remove different types of compounds, and these compounds are all going to have different impacts on global warming. So I thought, to sort of describe this a bit more, I threw up 3 example projects of different types of carbon offsets that can be generated. And the first one is going to be pretty relevant to what you folks do, which is a biosolids project. So this is an aerobic wastewater treatment facility. And so what they do is they actually capture methane from wastewater that would otherwise be released into the atmosphere. And so this is a reduction and removal of CO2 equivalent in the form of methane from the atmosphere. Some of the other examples that I put up here, the next one is actually really important in Canada. We're placing a lot of emphasis on carbon sequestration, which is actually capturing carbon from industrial facilities and then permanently storing them in underground caverns. And so those types of projects create carbon offsets. And then the last one I put up just because this is my background and I'm really passionate about renewable electricity. In jurisdictions where you have generation that is fossil fuel based. So where I'm from in Alberta, we've got coal and natural gas fired electricity. So every time a renewable energy project generates an electron, it displaces carbon that would have otherwise been generated from a fossil fuel facility. And so that's another way of creating carbon offsets is that a reduction or displacement. So once you have these carbon offsets, and so carbon offsets can be made from multiple types of technologies, anything that actually reduces or removes carbon from the atmosphere. Once you have them, then what do you do with them? And this is where we're seeing carbon markets kind of pop up around the world. And these markets are generally managed by a registry. And the registry sort of has two main functions. The first function is once you have a project that generates carbon offsets or emission offset credits, you've got to validate that those are true reductions or removal of carbon. And so this is the work that BrightSpot does. We do a lot of this auditing. And then once they're verified, they get posted onto the registry. And once we're on the registry, then an organization or a buyer, someone that has a need to reduce their emissions or have made some commitments to reduce emissions, they have the opportunity then to buy these emission offset credits or carbon offsets against their own emission profile. And so the registry acts as a centralized place that these carbon offsets are located, where these organizations can come and buy them. And the second benefit for these registries is that they allow the buyers then to connect with these projects and actually, pay these projects for their emission offsets. And so these emission offset credits actually have value. And when you get this transaction happening, it allows these projects to have an additional revenue stream that makes these projects more feasible. So I want to talk a little bit more about this buyer side. Because there's going to be different types of buyers who are motivated to buy these emission offset credits. And so when we look at carbon markets, we kind of consider them under two categories, voluntary and regulated. And so you might have seen a lot of organizations these days are stating emission reduction targets like, we'll reduce emissions by 20% below 2005 levels, those sorts of things. Or another big one that's happening these days is, vowing to be carbon neutral by 2050. So these are all voluntary type commitments where there's no legislation attached to the emission reduction. So these organizations are looking to voluntarily reduce their emissions, and they can use carbon offsets to help them achieve those goals. The other side of it is going to be on the regulated side. So the province that I'm from, we actually have a regulation called the Technology Innovation and Emission Reductions Regulation, where it places a legislated reduction obligation on high emitters. So we see if you're a coal facility or an oil sands facility, you're actually going to have to reduce your emissions by a specific amount each year. And if you can't reduce your emissions by a specific amount each year, then you either have to pay a tax into like a carbon tax, or you can buy these emission offset credits. So we talk about emission offsets in terms of, can they be used in the voluntary system or can they be used in the regulated system? And where I'm from in Alberta, what's interesting is we have a centralized registry for emission offset credits, and the emission offset credits can be used for either or. And what's interesting is that, and we can get into this later if you guys want to talk a little bit more about the value of carbon offsets, is that regulated carbon offsets tend to have a much higher value than voluntary carbon offsets because they're legislated. There's a legislated price of carbon attached to that. So in Alberta, if you're generating an emission offset, you're most likely going to get higher value for that if you're selling it in the regulated side of things to facilities that have compliance obligations than if you were in the voluntary side. So with that said, I'm going to pass it over to Sheldon. He's going to talk a little bit about what's happening sort of globally with carbon markets.
Sure. Thanks, Keith. So on this slide, we have a little bit of a layout of the regulated carbon markets that are either active or prospective kind of carbon markets. And like Keith mentioned, like you do get a little bit more value out of the offsets that work within regulated systems. And so on the left, we have North America zoomed in a little bit. You can't quite see it in this slide. But in Canada, you can see, I'm assuming there are folks both from Canada and the States on the call. So in Canada, we have a carbon price that's applied at the federal level, and several provinces and territories have taken it upon themselves to create their own systems that work within the bounds of the federal system. And so as a result, you have things like a carbon tax in place in one province, and you have things like a cap and trade system in other provinces. Consequently, because they have these differing systems, some provinces have their own offset systems as a result. But the point here is that within Canada, there are regulated offset systems or offset systems that work within the bounds of regulation across the country. In the States, you can see that there's a larger gap, and I am aware that there are a few cities that have their own kind of carbon trading regimes. But the bigger ones at play here, California's carbon market has been the most active one for a long time, since I think the mid 2000s or early 2000s. And on the East Coast, you have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, which is an aggregation of, I can't remember, but it must be like 5, 6, or 7 states that have all come together under one kind of geographic region to say, we want to impose this kind of carbon price on all of these states. There's an opportunity for a regulation caliber offsets to be produced in that system as well. So yeah, and that's kind of the North American landscape. You can see Europe has had an emissions trading system for a very long time. I believe, actually precedes California's. And you can see other parts of the world starting to, at the very least, think about implementing carbon trading regimes. So if we move on to the next slide, Keith, please. So what I wanted to bring up here is the evolving landscape of the way that offsets are perceived. And in particular, Keith mentioned this towards the beginning of our presentation, but offsets can both be categorized as, let's put them into 2 buckets. So one being emission reductions and the other being emission removals. The terminology is somewhat fluid, especially around the removals. Sometimes they're termed as removals or removal enhancements, but for the sake of argument, we'll just say there are the 2, reductions and removals. So for now, under most carbon trading regimes and even voluntary frameworks, the reductions have the same value as removals. So it doesn't quite matter which one you are producing. The likelihood is that a buyer will look at it and say, okay, this is a carbon offset, period. I'm going to buy it. Therefore, I can claim that I'm carbon neutral, et cetera. Now, in recent months and over the kind of last year and a half, there's an organization called the Science Based Targets Initiative that has taken it upon themselves as a nonprofit organization to really define especially the term net zero. And I'm confident, like most of you have probably heard the term net zero. There's a lot of organizations out there that are making commitments to be net zero by 2030, by 2050, et cetera. And the reason I bring this up is because the Science Based Targets Initiative, there's a lot of support for them, and it seems like the landscape is moving in the direction that SBTI is suggesting, in that net zero and carbon neutral are distinctive terms. And so carbon neutral means that, as an organization, you quantify your emissions, you reduce as much as you can, and the rest you can offset. And those offsets can either be reductions or removals. So that's kind of the way that it has been for a long period of time. Now, what we're looking at is SBTI applying the term net zero and suggesting that kind of the similar process for carbon neutral being you quantify your emissions, you reduce as much as you can, And then the remaining, you have to offset, but only offset using removals. So there's that key distinction there where reductions and removals are applicable in the carbon neutral kind of terminology, but only removals are applicable in the net zero terminology. And the reason I bring all of this up is because going forwards, there seems a strong likelihood that the value placed on offsets will likely be higher on the removal side than it will be on the reduction side. This is very much an evolving landscape, but we're seeing, SBTI is one organization, but we're seeing even the organizations that are more kind of from the financial sector, or the ones kind of the movement that Mark Carney is leading. A lot of them are aligned with this particular type of thinking. And so the likelihood is that we will see removals start to gain more value than reduction. So that's something to keep in mind, as prospective project developers.
Great, thanks, Sheldon. So I thought I'd move into a little bit of, okay, we've got an offset project. What's the process like? How do we actually go from thinking about a project to selling and retiring offset credits to an organization? So I outlined here, 6 bouncing balls of essentially, the steps that are required for a project to move through that whole process. So the first stage is really when you're looking at your project, what is your type of project? The examples I gave at the beginning, are you a renewable electricity project? Are you an anaerobic digester project? You need to sort of think about like what are you trying to accomplish with the technology that you're trying to implement. And once you have that decided, depending on the jurisdiction that you're in, so the second ball here is there a methodology available for you to actually quantify the carbon removal or reduction in your project? And so we talk about these in terms of protocols. And so different jurisdictions will have different protocols in place for different technologies. And it's really just an approved document by the GHG registry that outlines exactly how you go about quantifying the emissions reduction. So if there is a protocol already developed in place, so for example, the wastewater treatment example, there is a protocol in Alberta that walks you through the quantification methodology for the project, then you can apply that protocol to your project type. But if there isn't a protocol, then there's an opportunity potentially for you to develop a new one. And Sheldon's going to talk about that in the next slide. But assuming that there's a protocol for your development, the third step for your project is to actually submit what we call a project plan to the GHG body in your jurisdiction. And the project plan essentially just outlines, what type of project are you doing? What are your emission reductions? How many emission reductions or removals do you think you're going to do? What's the methodology you're going to implement? So what protocol? And how long do you think you're going to be able to do it for? And so, you outline all that to the GHG program and you file it with them. The next step is you implement your project. So you develop your project, you put into commercial operation, and then you start actually reducing or removing carbon. You file all the information with respect to your active project with the offset program in the jurisdiction that you're in. Once you start operating, then this kind of kicks off your tracking. So, if you're a renewable energy project, you start tracking the electricity that you're generating. And we typically see offset projects have, say, a year-long reporting period. So after a year of recording your data and tracking all your emissions, then you actually have to complete your accounting for your offset project. So this is the fifth bubble there. And I talked briefly about Brightspot doing the verification for these types of things. So once you calculate all your emission offsets, then you have to verify and you have to get them audited. And then once they're audited, that's when they can actually be posted to the registry. And each emission offset credit or offset is assigned a unique serial number. And that means that you can then serialize the emission offsets to the registry, and then they can be transferred to different organizations based on whoever wants to purchase your emission offset credits. Once they have been posted and once they've been transferred to an entity, then the sixth bubble here is retirement. So an organization that has either a compliance obligation to reduce emissions or a voluntary commitment to reduce emissions can take your emission offset credits, retire them, and then they're no longer available for any use on the registry. And then I'll pass over to Sheldon, who can talk a little bit more about that protocol.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Keith. So we've, you know, at Brightspot, we help out with the protocol development process, and we've done this both in kind of regulated caliber offset markets and in voluntary caliber offset markets. And we see that there are generally two ways to go about the protocol development process. And so the one on the left is one being more active. And so, you know, we've seen this in a few jurisdictions where we have a confluence of prospective project developers who approach either a government or a registry, depending on whether it's regulated or voluntary, and say, hey, look, we have identified this activity that we know actionably reduces greenhouse gases or removes greenhouse gases. And we think it would be suitable as an offset project protocol. What do you think? And so approaching the registry kind of that way, it's, you know, it is likely more productive, or at least a more efficient process to go about it, because really you're approaching the registry with a solution already kind of built. And sometimes, you know, you might engage a consultant to help out with this type of work, or you can kind of go about most of this work yourselves and just figure out the bones of what a protocol would look like, and then work with the registry to figure out, okay, here are the particular parameters or requirements that we need to fulfill. And so, and you start kind of down the protocol development process. And so the timeline for that, it can be fluid. So if if you have something in place already, you approach the registry, it can take anywhere from, a few months to potentially like a year or two to get a protocol developed. And obviously, for governments, it takes a little bit longer to get things approved and so forth than it would for a voluntary registry. So that's on the active side of things. On the passive side of things, you have a registry itself, again, whether that's a government or a voluntary registry, that says, okay, the registry, we have identified that there is this opportunity to reduce emissions or remove emissions in this context. And they list that as a priority for the registry. And so they go about creating the protocol themselves. And so often this involves a lot of stakeholder engagement. And so, the folks on the phone, the likelihood is that if there were, a registry, let's say the gold standard or the Vera standard, which are both voluntary registries, if they were to go about creating a biosolids protocol, you are likely part of the stakeholders that would be engaged to help figure out, okay, the registry wants to create this protocol. We want to make sure that it's actually going to result in projects that reduce emissions. So how can we work together between the registry and project developers to actually get projects up off the ground, sooner rather than later, and importantly, make sure that that the projects actionably reduce or remove emissions. So there are kind of those two ways to go about protocol development. And next slide, please, Keith. Right. So yeah, I'm not going to touch on all of these, but I think there's two key components that need to be taken into account for protocol development in terms of challenges. So one of the things to take into account is that, especially in your regulated carbon markets, there's already an incentive in place in a few different kind of areas. So let's say, let's use the example of a carbon tax applied on fossil fuels, let's say, just as a whole. Let's say in BC, that is the case. So there is a carbon tax applied on fossil fuels. So you're paying the carbon tax on gasoline, you're paying the carbon tax on natural gas, et cetera. So there is already an incentive, an economic incentive in place to move your activities so that you're not burning as much natural gas and you're not using gasoline, maybe you buy electric vehicles or switch to air source heat pumps or whatever the case might be. So in that case, offsets need to take place outside the regulation. So offsets largely take place outside of any kind of cap imposed on emissions. So what that means is, in the context of this example of British Columbia, is that something like forestry activities, so sequestering carbon actively into forests or growing forests as an example, that would be a prospective possibility, and that is an active kind of offset protocol in British Columbia. So that's one important parameter to keep in mind, is that the offsets should take place outside of any kind of regulation. The goal here is so that there's nothing that is receiving a double incentive or nothing that's receiving a double penalty. So essentially, in this sense, any kind of registry, they want to create fairness so that nobody is particularly favored from an economic perspective. So that's the probably one of the most important parameters. And the second one is the third bullet point here, which is whether the reductions or removals are likely to be additional. And so the concept of additionality really is framed as in developing the project, in creating an offset project, are there barriers that are being overcome in creating the project? So like if the project is, I'm going to install solar panels on my house, let's say, but the cost of solar panels is equal to what I would pay for electricity from the grid anyways, then obviously I'm not actually reducing emissions that way. So really what I mean by this is that the additionality component should indicate that there are real and verifiable emission reductions that are taking place. As long as there are barriers in place, whether they're financial, whether they're technical, or whether they're regulatory, then the likelihood is that the project will be considered additional. But from our perspective, often as a verifier, additionality is one of the parameters that we look at most closely, because effectively we just don't, you don't want to give an incentive to somebody for doing something they would have already done anyways. You want to ensure that the offset project is actionably reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So there are obviously a laundry list of other kind of parameters to be considered here, but those are the two kind of big ones that I thought really needed to be fleshed out a little bit more. And I'll pass it back to you, Keith.
Great, thanks. So I'm in Alberta, so I deal a lot with the Alberta Emission Offset Registry, and I thought it might be just interesting to show you kind of what a registry listing looks like in a regulated jurisdiction such as Alberta. So the example that I have up here, this is the Alberta Carbon Registries. It's actually ran by the Canadian Standards Association, but they run it on behalf of the Alberta government, essentially. And here we've got the listing, and I in the search field here, I put aerobic because I thought that might be interesting for you folks. And you can see that we've got 9 projects in Alberta that sort of fall under this aerobic type protocol. And the one that I thought was really interesting was this biomethanation with power generation. And so this is the example that I was talking about kind of at the beginning, where they take wastewater. And what's really interesting about this project is they actually generate emission offset credits in 2 ways in Alberta. So the first way is that they collect the methane from the wastewater effluent, and that methane would have otherwise been rejected to the atmosphere. And we talked about the global warming potential at the very beginning. So capturing that methane, they get 25 times the carbon equivalent as if you were going to compared to if you were just collecting carbon. So that's the first way that they're generating emission offset credits, is just by collecting the methane that would have otherwise been rejected to atmosphere. And the second way they do it is in Alberta, there's a protocol for electricity production or displacing electricity when you're using a renewable source. So in this case, they're using the methane now to generate electricity, and that electricity is displacing a mix of grid electricity that would have otherwise been provided by a mix of fossil fuel and other technologies. So they actually get credit for 2 different types of emission offsets in Alberta. And so you can see here at the bottom, so far they've generated about 48,000 tons of emission offset credits. And you can see kind of, if you can see this up here, this is their estimated lifetime emission reduction. So that would have been submitted as part of their project plan. So they expect that they'll generate about 100,000 tons of emission offset credits in the lifespan of this project. And so they're about halfway there. And then what you can see on these other bubbles is this first one is about 16,000 tons of those offsets are still active, which means that they're posted to the registry, they're available. So they're serialized, they have each unique serial numbers, and they're available to be purchased by any organization that would like to purchase them. In Alberta, the emission offset registry it doesn't act as a clearinghouse. So any of the transactions that occur outside of this registry. This registry just acts as the the tracking. So if emission offsets are still active, or in this case they're pending retirement, so 32,000 are pending retirement, which means that they've been allocated to somebody in terms of an emission reduction, and then likely within the next year or so they'll all be retired once all the paperwork kind of clears through. So this just kind of shows you, this project that's been registered in Alberta, generates real quantifiable emission offsets. And Sheldon talked a lot about this concept of additionality. So, in this case, they're creating a revenue stream because they're able to sell these emission offsets to a third party. And it's a revenue stream that wouldn't have otherwise been there outside of the emission offset project. So I think that's sort of the crux of all of this is, I think you guys are interested in, how do we generate this additional revenue stream for our projects? How do we get into some of these markets? How do we influence emission offset protocol development? Even just you saw the map of the United States. There aren't many states that actually have carbon pricing or emission trading systems. So how do you influence those sorts of policies? So I hope that we kind of gave you a bit of a flavor in terms of the process by which offset projects are happening, what goes into protocol development, all these sorts of things to sort of guide you on your way. So with that, we're happy to take questions.
Sure. Can you see the chat, Keith?
Oh, yes.
So
the
there's a
question
question
is,
from Ned.
who are the leading registries that would be helpful for biosolids and wastewater offset projects in the US and Canada right now? So Sheldon, I believe Alberta and BC both have offsets. And then I think you know more about the US markets than I do. Do you want to talk a little about that?
Yeah, so specifically pertaining to biosolids and wastewater offset projects, for Canada, let's say the active protocols right now, there is, as Keith kind of showed, there is an active protocol in Alberta. So, hypothetically that it would be easiest to get an offset project off the ground and kind of generating offsets, sooner rather than another registry. And specifically within for biosolids, I'm trying to remember, Saskatchewan will likely have kind of protocols in place that pertain to biosolids potentially within the next couple of years. So that's one that may emerge fairly soon. And I believe that's Canada, because the other thing is that the federal government is developing its own set of protocols, and they have prioritized waste as one of the activities and kind of the reuse or the capture or use of emissions related to waste as part of their protocols. And I believe those are also supposed to be published, within the next year or so. And so there would be an opportunity for quite a few provinces and territories to generate offsets as related to biosolids and wastewater in Canada. So in the States, I'm not as cognizant of the protocols that are in place. In California, which is the largest registry, I believe, no, actually, you know what? I don't think there is an active protocol in place because landfills are regulated, and usually that would be one of the primary activities that would be undertaken, which obviously isn't wastewater. And then for other registries, the voluntary registries, I'd have to do kind of a sweep of those, but there are a few, the gold standard, Vera, are kind of the American Carbon Registry are the three that come to mind that may have protocols in place. But those kind of would be the best bets. In terms of who has the greatest credibility now and who is the most active, again, like our experience and our kind of knowledge is really primarily in Canada. In Canada, the most active offset market by far is Alberta's. Alberta's had an active offset market since 2008. So theirs has the most history. And because it has the most history, and projects have been listed on that for a number of years, it has the most credibility as well. The BC offset market is a little bit of a question mark because of a few different regulatory parameters that kind of shifted and shifted back and so forth. BC's offset market is fairly old as well. And Quebec's is also fairly old. They started their offset program, I think, around the same time, 2008, 2009. But their list of protocols is quite a bit thinner than Alberta's. And part of the reason for that largely is because, as I described, you want activities to take place outside of regulation. Quebec has a lot of regulations in place, and so the activities eligible for offsets are fewer. Alberta has fewer regulations in place, and so the opportunity for offsets are greater in Alberta. Yeah, I think, yeah, that should be, and yeah, I wish I could provide a little bit more context with regards to the US, but like I said, our kind of expertise is mostly in Canada. I don't know, Keith, if you have anything to add on that.
No, I don't. Good job.
Um,
But I can take the next question.
Sure, go ahead.
Which is about, does a project have to take place in Alberta to generate credits, i.e. could the Alberta protocol be applied to an RGGI project? So Alberta is a fascinating place because, as Sheldon said, it's been in place since 2008. And so, when I was talking about sort of voluntary versus regulatory markets in Alberta, if you're generating a compliance type credit from an Alberta protocol, those have limited use outside of Alberta because Alberta is regulated. The compliance type credits are regulated by the tier regulation, which is specific only to Alberta. So if you're generating an emission offset credit to sell to a high emitter in Alberta, that has limited use outside of Alberta, but that doesn't mean that offset credits can't be generated in Alberta and sold elsewhere. So in Canada, we have what's called the clean, what is it called, Sheldon? The clean, what's the federal?
Clean fuel standard?
No, the federal registry, Clean Projects Registry. Sorry, thank you.
Oh yeah, the CSA.
Yeah,
registry,
yeah, the Clean Projects Registry. So that's a federal registry where if you generate an offset in any jurisdiction in Canada, you can post onto that registry, but that's only going to be used for voluntary compliance. And we talked a little bit about the value of an emission offset credit in the regulatory side of things versus voluntary. And so you're motivated to keep your emission offset credits in the compliance market just because you're going to get much more value for it. The answer to your question is kind of yes and no. You can definitely take emission offset credits outside of Alberta and use them elsewhere, but you're generally not going to get the value for those emission offset credits then if you were to use those as compliance obligations in Alberta.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, it just depends on the limits that the registry has imposed. So, the CSA Clean Projects Registry, they have said, on this registry, any project is eligible as long as it is verifiable and additional. So you could use kind of any protocol, even from seemingly voluntary programs or Canadian kind of regulatory programs to produce offsets that can be sold on that registry. So really, if Reggie were to say, we have these 5 or 6 protocols in place, but if you identify a protocol from another jurisdiction that maybe has equivalency, maybe even not, maybe Reggie would need to figure out if there's equivalency. And then Reggie would say, yes, maybe this project is permissible within the bounds of Reggie. Then it could conceivably be that you could generate credits within Reggie using an Alberta protocol. The likelihood is because they are 2 distinctive regulatory programs. The likelihood is that Reggie would generate their own protocol, but that's, I'm not entirely sure about that. Yeah.
Janine, could I ask a question?
yeah, Bill, go right ahead.
Thanks, guys. This was really fascinating. So I don't know how much you know about biosolids. Most people don't know a lot, but basically, it's a solids that's a residual from doing wastewater treatment. It's organic matter, it's nutrients, it's very good for the soil. Historically, a lot of it maybe was landfilled, but a lot is applied to the land as well. And so that's kind of what our group is interested in, is you're putting that organic matter onto the soil and sequestering the carbon. I think the biggest question for me that seems to coming up, and you guys touch on it, is additionality. So is the additionality in terms of whom? So like, if you have a wastewater treatment plant, some of them are currently land applying all of their biosolids anyways. So it's all going to land, it's all sequestering that carbon already. So we've talked about kind of a workaround, is that an individual farm may not have received biosolids in the past, and having an incentive like getting carbon credits or offsets could entice them to take biosolids. So that's kind of one scenario. The other one is it's a wastewater treatment plant where some or all of their biosolids are currently going to landfill, where it'd be generating methane emissions and all that. So taking some of that, and if it were $50 a ton of biosolids, if that were the card, it's not, but whatever. If that's what it were, that would change a lot of behavior for biosolids around the US. So, but if it were $2, it'd be harder to show. But if you were shifting from some landfill to that based off of the carbon price, that seems like another way to get that around, like to get that additionality piece. So I don't know, what are your thoughts of like how can, we know what biosolids, when you go on the ground, you're getting carbon sequestration. How can we get these projects to get carbon offsets given those realities?
Yeah, I guess the first kind of point in terms of like farms already adopting biosolids as a soil amendment or so forth, that in all likelihood, to be honest, I mean, that would kind of defeat the purpose of listing these projects as offsets. That being said, there is actually, and it would depend, where these, I guess the soil amendment is applied. And I say that because there has been a push in Alberta and in a few other provinces in Canada to create, and there are several agricultural kind of sector protocols in place. And one of them that has been worked on over the last number of years is the nitrogen emission reduction protocol, meaning that in the baseline scenario, a lot of these farms are applying nitrogen, like manufactured nitrogen fertilizer, as to encourage the production of crops. And they have used kind of other types of soil amendments. And that kind of is characterized, your baseline being your nitrogen applied fertilizer, and your project scenario being your soil amendment that is more natural. And I believe biosolids are one of the kind of components that can act as that amendment. And so in that scenario, you do have the opportunity to generate offsets. So there is that kind of activity that does take place in Alberta. So that's on the farm side of things. In the case, to your second point, in terms of the landfills specifically, there may be an opportunity, for avoided landfill emissions. And this would really be characterized as like, your baseline condition being your biosolids are going straight to landfill, they're generating methane emissions, and kind of similar to the example that Keith was using, in your project scenario, you are diverting those away from landfill, you are directing them to another use that potentially would be capturing emissions or using kind of that product in another way. Therefore, there is an activity, your baseline would be your landfill emissions are up to here, and then your project emissions are up to here where you're applying them. And so that kind of difference is what you could conceivably claim as a reduction. So there are, I think both of those could be kind of possible routes to go down.
And I think a good way to think about it is what would have happened in the absence of the project. So if the biosolids were being diverted to landfill without implementation of the project, then when you implemented the project, what would have happened? And that's kind of what Sheldon's referring to in terms of baseline versus project condition, is in the absence of the project. Like, so for the first example you said, where you're already putting it onto farmers' fields, the offset protocol, you're already doing it, so you're not incenting any different type of behavior. Whereas if you're trying to divert it from the landfill to generating methane for power generation or something like that, then you're actually creating that additionality, you know?
Yeah,
But it
so I think-
sounds like the farmers could get the credit in the other scenario. Maybe not the wastewater treatment facilities, but the farmers. Is that?
Yeah, so the interesting thing in Alberta, and this is something that has been tried and been used successfully in Alberta, is there's the concept of aggregated projects. And so, you know, if you have one farm in Alberta that is like, you know, let's say 5 hectares or something, and they're applying biosolids throughout the area, the number of credits that they would create over the course of even a year or 2 years, let's say it's like, you know, 100 credits. And at that point, you know, it doesn't make sense to go through the process of creating an offset project plan, creating an offset project report, going through the verification process, all of that. So what has happened is there's a couple of organizations centered in Alberta that have made themselves aggregators of farms. And so they will collect kind of all of the information of, you know, 100 or 150 or 500 farms. And then they will do all of that kind of document preparation and verification and kind of handling that administrative side of things on behalf of 500 farms. And then they will disperse kind of the proportion of credits according to how many emission reductions are achieved to each farm. So there is that structure in place that could conceivably be used.
Yeah, the Climate Action Reserve is the first one I'm aware of in the US that has something that includes biosolids. It's their soil enrichment protocol. And heard a presentation on it the other day, and they're saying that the additionality is in terms of the land. So it's just a land use change thing. So if no biosolids have been used even the last 3 years, you can get your baseline and then start to use biosolids. And then, you know, so it doesn't matter, you know, if those biosolids are coming from a plant that was already land applying, which, you know, I think that's, you know, it's good that there's a protocol out there that includes biosolids in the US and people might start to be able to get some money. But in terms of the climate, it's horrifying because then somebody's going to be paying for something that would have happened anyways. And I don't know.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and so, you know, that's the challenge, is that a lot of the questions that you probably have, they actually really depend on the registry itself and the rules that are in place that are, you know, created by the registry. And, you know, when we talk about the value of offsets right now, the price of an offset in Alberta, as an example, is close to $40 a ton, $40 Canadian, because the carbon price in Alberta is close to $40 a ton, or it is $40 a ton. Whereas in a voluntary offset kind of market, the likelihood, at least over the last couple of years, has been like you're more likely to get $5 to $6 Canadian a ton. So there's obviously that big distinction. And a lot of that distinction has had to do with the rigor of some of these markets, in that they, you know, people were creating projects and they were getting credits. And, you know, to your point, sometimes they were getting credits for actions that didn't necessarily reduce emissions. And so some of their credibility may have been affected as a result. And consequently, the prices that people would pay for those offsets are affected as a result. I can't remember, it's either the American Carbon Registry or the Climate Action Registry, one of which is applicable to the California regulated market as well. But so if CAR, or the Climate Action Reserve, is one of those voluntary registries, then yeah, it would, like I said, it would really depend on the specific rules that the registry has in place.
For the California registry, isn't there a tie to transportation fuel in some way? Is that, do you know how that link ties into this whole conversation?
yeah,
As far,
there's
sorry, no, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, there it's like transportation miles is I don't think it actually is in there, but it's also not included for the inorganic fertilizer that you'd be displacing. So I think transportation is outside the box, if I remember right.
Yeah, so sometimes if there's, and again, it goes back to that conversation around what is included has to be outside of regulation and what is excluded. But for a number of protocols, you will have the requirement to quantify kind of the impact of, let's say, the transportation related emissions. And in California has a cap and trade system, and as far as I know, does not have a carbon tax on gasoline or diesel or whatever. So it may be that the protocol requires the quantification of the emissions associated with transportation, and they're included, but I'm not sure whether they would be included or not in that.
Do you have a low carbon fuel standard so that I don't
Oh,
think
right.
you-
Yes, that's right. Yeah. That was the one.
Thanks, Bobby. So just so we're clear, that use of biosolids that increase the carbon sequestration capacity of the soils, would that be considered a removal or a reduction?
Yeah, so it really depends on the protocol and how the baseline is categorized in the protocol and how the project condition is categorized in the protocol as well. Because if the baseline is your biosolids going to landfill, right, then those biosolids would be emitting methane.
Right.
And in the project condition, you would not be emitting methane. And so, there would be a reduction as a result. That being said, there could conceivably, and sometimes there are, activities where you have both reductions and removals that take place. And so it could be that if the activity of putting biosolids as a soil amendment onto farms actively sequesters carbon, and there's a quantifiable and verifiable way to go about that, then that could be construed as a removal in addition to the reduction of being diverted from landfill. So you'd be able to claim both of those kinds of activities.
Which is why we want to get in here on the ground floor and inform some of the US policy making that's coming along. So this is very helpful. And someone asked if you could share your slides, so shoot me your slides. I'll share it with the group as well. That was really helpful. Are there other questions while we have these two guys?
There is one I saw that I don't think we quite answered. And yes, we're happy to share the slides. Is there a rule of thumb around the size of project or credits available for this to make sense? Assuming bigger than backyard composting. And yes, the answer to that is, the answer to so many of these questions is it depends. But really in this context, right, it would depend on the size of the project. It would depend on how many offsets are assumed to be produced over the course of the lifetime of the project. And it would depend on the capital investment and the operational expenditures involved in the project as well, right? And then the last thing it would depend on is what the price of offsets is that you would get for it. And so that's why, in regulated systems, that's why we've highlighted regulated systems, because you often get a higher price for offsets for them. Like I said, a $38 to $40 a ton Canadian price in Alberta. And Canada's carbon price is projected or supposed to go to $170 a ton by 2030. And so you can only imagine, the number of activities that will now become, much more palatable from an economic perspective. And so you'll start to have project developers who all of a sudden say, okay, we have, this 5 to 10 year timeline, and this project activity, now its IRR is significantly shorter its payback is significantly shorter than what it would used to be if we have this carbon price in place. And so, if you're assuming a price of $40 per ton in 2020, going to $170 in 2030, you can create some kind of projection there. And based on that kind of revenue versus your expenditures, okay, this project might make sense. For the voluntary type projects that take place in voluntary registries, it's much more challenging. And the reason for that being, I'm sure you're all aware, there's a lot more interest in offsets and whether they're reductions or removals, because everyone and their uncle is, making a carbon neutral claim or a net zero claim. And so the price of voluntary offsets is going up as a result. Will it go up to the regulated price? The likelihood is probably not, but it will increase a little bit. And so those are some of the things that we keep an eye on as well, as much as we can. I'm sure as you all know, things are moving very, very quickly, too quickly. I'm very tired. Yeah, hopefully that answers that question.
Do you have a rough rule? I mean, before you were saying a small project, like one farm, if it's 50 tons a year or something, I mean, that sounds small. I was just looking at a calculator I have for a kind of medium sized biosolids compost facility, and their carbon sequestration that I calculated was 5,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year. Does that
Yeah, so-
sound like a reasonable sized project?
I think so. I mean, even I think the one, Keith, you were showing that had 100,000 tons, but over 10 years, right?
Yeah, 13 years, I think. So
Yeah. So
just under
that's
10.
roughly in line with that number, right?
Thank you.
I guess one of the last things I'd like to leave you with is it sounds like you're very familiar with like the climate action reserve protocols. I mean, we talk a lot about Canadian protocols just because they're pretty well established. So it'd be worth to poke around in some established protocols across the board in the US and in Canada, just to sort of gauge what the methodology looks like and what the baseline is defined as and what the project condition is defined as, because you can leverage a lot of the work that's already been done by other jurisdictions when you're thinking about going into the regions in the US that you're contemplating. So I think that's my final piece of advice.
And that's great. Thanks for bringing that up, Keith, because that's actually exactly what we're going to do for our next step. We got some volunteers who are going to dig into these programs across North America, Canada, and the US anyway. So now we're much better informed. I got a couple of leads there from some of your slides. And so that's what we're going to try and pull together next and get a handle on what's out there, what seems to be working well, and where we could maybe point some of these newer programs that are getting developed. So.
Just
Great.
one more context I do want to add. I know that carbon pricing in the US is controversial and there's a lot of hopeless feelings about ever getting there, but Canada has written a border adjustment tax into their law. And there's heavy discussions about whether that would be enforced, and the European Union is talking the same thing. So a glimmer of hope that we might be forced to do it.
You might shame us into it. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. There's lots of talk of that up here for sure. So
Oh,
yes.
thanks for mentioning that. So I'm not as hopeless feeling leaving the meeting.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Because the next steps are just going to be, I'm going to cancel the August meeting, and those of you who have assignments need to start digging in. But
Sorry, I apologize. I do have to drop off because I have to be speaking at another engagement right now. But
thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. And happy to answer kind of any questions that may come up. Yeah. So thanks, everyone.
All right.
Hey, Sheldon.
Thanks, Sheldon. Bye.
Yeah, feel free to. Janine has our contact information, so yeah, feel free if you have any questions as you're digging through. We really like to dig into some of these baseline and project condition methodology things. That's we don't get to do that very often, so it's kind of fun to hurt our brains a little bit on those exercises. So yeah, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. And yeah, nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you. Thanks,
Nice to meet
Keith.
you. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith.
Take
All right,
care.
folks. Thanks for joining us. You get back to your day jobs now. I'll follow up with email on all of you, and you know who you are who raised your hand, Mark and others. Bill. All right. Thanks. And Bobby,
you.
too. You got
Yeah.
half of
Hey,
Canada, I
thanks
Thanks
think.
for arranging,
Take
Bobby.
care.
All right.
See you.
Thanks, you
Take care.
guys.
Bye.
See you, everybody.
Bye.
All right. Take care.